It probably is pretty obvious that I'm going to be talking about some headgear today, more specifically about the M1 steel helmet. The M1 steel helmet is the standard helmet of the United States military and several other militaries around the world, at least from 1940 until the late 80s, I believe right around 1985 when it started to be phased out of service in favor of the Kevlar PAS GT or PAS GT. Now, the M1 steel helmet came into service with the United States military right around 1940, right before World War II. And it was a replacement of the old M1917 steel helmet, which can sometimes be referred to as the Tommy hat, or it's very reminiscent of the British helmet, because the British helmet of the First and Second World War, because when the United States military first got involved in the First World War, the United States military didn't have a steel helmet. Steel helmets are actually pretty much a necessity brought on by the First World War, and most countries began the war without them. The British themselves used cloth hats. The Germans themselves didn't have helmets either. They had some helmets made out of leather, but no actual steel helmets. The United States was no different. We had no steel helmets at all. So when the American Expeditionary Force arrived for the First World War, they were sold or given helmets by the British, and those pretty much stayed in service in that same design right up to the beginning of the Second World War, and it was replaced by the M1 steel helmet. Now, how does this relate to props? Well, obviously they've been used to make quite a few props throughout film history. One of the most heavily modified versions of it is, of course, the 1986 Aliens Colonial Marine helmets. Now, the purpose of this video is to give you an idea of how the M1 steel helmet came into being, what it was used for in film, and how to go about identifying one, so that if you do decide to use a real steel helmet to make a prop or cosplay, you don't spend too much money. Because there are a couple of dead giveaways as to buying a later manufactured M1 steel helmet versus an original World War II. And that phrase in and of itself, original World War II, in reference to the M1 steel helmet, is a bit of a pitfall, because there is a very specific definition of what original World War II helmets are. So let's go ahead and start out and have a look at one of these M1 steel helmets, and so you can at least get an idea of what nomenclature I'm using when I talk about these. So we're going to use this rather terribly painted version of a brown coat helmet of the Joss Whedon series, Firefly. Now, it was just a simple repaint, two different kinds of brown, some weathering, Bob's your uncle, done. In the very beginning of the pilot episode of Firefly, there's the Battle of Serenity Valley takes place, and a lot of the soldiers are wearing these style of helmets. And there's a mixture of Russian helmets and these M1 steel helmets. Now, all M1 steel helmets pretty much work the same way. You have the steel outer shell, and then the liner. And the liner has all of your webbing to make it fit on your head and not just be a regular steel shell on it. With the early World War II helmets, these things here that your chin strap's attached to are what are referred to as bales. Now, on the early helmets, the early World War II helmets, these were fixed. They didn't swivel back and forth. And when the helmet was set down on the ground, they had a tendency to break. So they were replaced with the swivel bales. And that design largely did not change throughout the rest of this thing's manufacture. The other minor difference with the World War II helmets, the early ones at least, was this seam right here, which is on the back of the helmet. You can just make out a seam of this stainless steel reinforcement rim around here, was actually on the front. Now, with most World War II helmets, they also will have a number stamped inside somewhere. And if it's an alphanumeric, as in some numbers on a letter, and then it's made by a company called McCord, most likely. But there were several different manufacturers of helmets, and the codes that are stamped into these helmets will tell you what the manufacturer was and roughly when it was made. The liners, this is a pressed fiber type of liner. So this one is actually, I believe this is from the Vietnam period or just after. But all of them will have a stamp, just see it, inside the liner that gives away who its manufacturer is and more or less when it was made. And then on the webbing, you'll have different indicators of, I think this one is late 70s was when this was made. Or no, this one's actually 1969. So this one is actually from 1969. So this is a Vietnam era liner, I believe. I may be wrong. I'm not an expert on the M1 steel helmet. However, they all work exactly the same way. The liner goes into the helmet, you put it on your head. That's pretty much how they work. Now, a lot of films have used these, obviously, not just Firefly / Serenity, but also most famously, or at least arguably most famously, 1986's Aliens. James Cameron wanted the Colonial Marines to evoke a sort of Vietnam aesthetic, so they used a lot of Vietnam-esque equipment, and more specifically, they used a Vietnam-specific M1 steel helmets. Now this one has been extremely heavily modified, just like they were for the film, and this is one of the more over-the-top modifications of the M1 steel helmet seen in movies. And this is built using a kit from Spatcave, spatcave.com. Spat's a really awesome guy who's been making costumes and costume components for the Aliens Colonial Marines for many years, and I bought this kit from him a long time ago and modified it into this. Now this liner is a much later production liner. It's this light green inside and this much more comfortable webbing with the leather band right here, and then you can see where cuts have been made into the helmet, and then things riveted in place, this camera, and then the ear flap here. And this is just, well, of course, the lobster plate on the back, which has had to have some cuts put in it, and then the whole thing is essentially attached together, and the liner is no longer removable. But this is one of the more extreme examples of modification of an M1 steel helmet for use in film or in cosplay. And then another example of the M1 steel helmet that is very recent is actually from Star Wars Rogue One, or Rogue One, a Star Wars story, depending on who you ask. And this is just an M1 steel helmet with a helmet cover. We'll get into the reason why the helmet covers are so important, because they became very prevalent on the M1 steel helmet later on in its service. But this is, again, a Vietnam era liner. It's had an X painted on it for some reason. And then this helmet cover that goes over the top of it. And this is, again, it's a rear seam helmet with swivel bails, and these are correct Vietnam period chin straps with a little gubbin put on there. I'm not sure what that thing's supposed to be. I've not really gotten a good story on it, but it is just a very, very simple thing to do, to just make a helmet cover. Well, perhaps maybe not make the helmet cover, but put it on, and then 3D print out this shell. This Rebel Commando shell was made by Cody's Pictures and Stuff on Thingiverse, and I printed it out a couple years ago, and it's sat on this helmet collecting dust for a long time. But it's a really nice version of it, and it's just a simple M1 steel helmet with a cover. These modifications of these things are extremely simple. And then use of them in cosplay. Now, they are a bit heavy, and there are fiberglass and plastic versions of these things available. But if you're going for accuracy and specificity, using the real thing is not that hard. The issue you come into is when you attempt to use period correct World War II components, which this is the Captain America rescue helmet from Captain America: The First Avenger, where he goes and rescues Bucky Barnes. It's his first combat action is what it is. And this is made with a 1944 McCord steel shell. I don't want to take this apart because this coating on here is a bit fragile, and I'll get into that in a second. But it's a late war K-Pack M1C jump liner. Now the M1C jump liners were modified specifically for paratroopers, and they have these A-straps here, which are used to attach a leather chin cup, and that's to keep the helmet on the head during a parachute jump. And it still had its regular old chin straps on it. Now these chin straps here are the only part of this that are not original World War II components. Now a little bit more about that phrase that I used earlier. Original World War II M1 steel helmet. That's a phrase that has quite a few pitfalls in it. When I say original World War II M1 steel helmet, what I mean is an M1 steel helmet that has not changed since 1945. Now these helmets stayed in service for a very long time. So after the Second World War, they were used again in Korea, they were used again in Vietnam, and some of those original helmets going back to the 40s stayed in service for a long time. Some of them stayed in service all the way up till the end of the service life of the M1 steel helmet. Very few by that time, but some still did. Now, if someone advertises an original World War II M1 steel helmet, What that means, if it's an accurate advertisement, is that this helmet that they're selling is the same liner, the same chin straps, the same paint, more or less. A lot of it could be worn off. All original, no major repairs done, and it has not gone through a rebuild or has been expertly restored. When you see a lot of these M1 helmets for sale, they often say World War II helmet on them because people associate the shape and often the color green they're painted with World War II. And most people don't know the difference, and that's just how it is. Folks that collect these things are very specific about what is and is not original World War II. The liner must be exactly the same material inside. The webbing must not have changed or be period correct replacements. The chin strap's the same. They must be period correct replacements. The paint and then this anti-glare coating, for lack of a better term. In the 1940s, these helmets were coated in crushed cork, and it was thought that it would prevent glare and help conceal the wearer a little bit better. In the 1950s, it was changed to sand, and then it was done away with altogether because of the introduction of the more prevalent helmet covers. It was a lot easier to put a helmet cover on a helmet than it was to repaint it, depending on the environment that you were going to be fighting in. So a lot of the older, quite frankly, original World War II helmets will have this coating on it. Now, when I got this specific helmet that I used to make Captain America's rescue helmet from the first Avenger, it had no coating left. It had been repainted probably 1,000 times based on how much paint I took off of it. And it was covered in corrosion, and it was just in terrible shape. There were no chin straps on it anymore. So of all the equipment that's here that is more or less original World War II, I say that with finger quotes, because the liner, though it is a World War II K-Pack liner, the webbing that's in it was actually put in it sometime in the 50s. So it's not original World War II either. But a lot of these components are from the Second World War. It's also painted up as Captain America's helmet, so it's not original anymore anyway. But that's how they go. Now, if you want to make Captain America's rescue helmet like I've done here, you'll need to put the anti-glare coating on it, paint it the correct color of blue, which the color blue I have on here is pretty close to what's seen on screen. And it's a mixture of Tamiya XF82 Ocean Gray 2 RAF and their standard flat blue, which I believe is X4. And it's a 70-30 mix, blue to gray, and it ended up coming out pretty close to accurate. Now, the other component on this that sets it off from any other helmet besides it being painted blue and having a big A on it is the goggles. And those goggles are what are called AN6530 pilot's goggles. Those are original AN6530s on this helmet. I will probably never wear this. It will probably just be for display for the entire time that I have it. If you want to build one of these, there are reproductions available, but strangely enough, the reproductions are actually just as expensive as the real ones. So if you're going to do one for cosplay, I'd recommend going with the reproductions. Thank you again for watching. I hope that this was educational and that it helps you with your decision to either buy an M1 steel helmet or maybe perhaps build one of these props. Maybe you'll go to Spat Cave and buy his set to modify one of these helmets, or you'll want to make a Captain America helmet or one from Rogue One or one of these guys, or one of the other plethora of different versions of the M1 steel helmet used throughout film. Once again, thank you for watching, and cheers.